On a quiet summer morning in 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘳𝘢, Ohio, 3 young people climbed into a car expecting another ordinary day. Within minutes, 2 of them would be dead. The third would survive, and soon find herself at the center of one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern America. At first, it looked like a devastating high-speed crash, but as investigators began collecting evidence, they uncovered details that challenged that assumption. Surveillance cameras captured the vehicle's final moments. The car's onboard computer revealed exactly how fast it had been traveling. Detectives examined text messages, phone records, and the relationships between the 3 teenagers. Piece by piece, they began asking a question that would divide the public for years. Was this simply a tragic accident, or had someone deliberately turned a car into a weapon? The answer would depend on far more than emotion. It would rest on digital evidence, forensic reconstruction, expert testimony, and a courtroom battle over one of the hardest things to prove in criminal law: intent. This is the story of Mackenzie Shirilla, a case that blurred the line between reckless driving and murder, leaving 2 families grieving and a nation debating whether justice had truly been served. To understand how that question emerged, we have to go back to the lives of the 3 young people before everything changed. During the summer of 2022, 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla lived in northeastern Ohio. Like many teenagers her age, she was balancing friendships, family life, and the uncertainties that often come with growing up. Those who knew her described different sides of her personality. Friends and classmates recalled someone who could be caring and outgoing, while others described emotional ups and downs that were not uncommon among teenagers navigating relationships and personal struggles. One of the most significant people in her life was 20-year-old 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘴𝘩. Their relationship had experienced periods of closeness as well as conflict. Friends later described it as complicated. Like many young couples, they argued, reconciled, and sometimes struggled to communicate. Investigators would later spend countless hours examining those dynamics because prosecutors believed the state of their relationship held the key to understanding what happened. 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘴𝘩 was known by family and friends as energetic and social. He enjoyed spending time with those closest to him and had plans for his future like many young adults his age. Those who loved him remembered his sense of humor and his loyalty to the people around him. Also part of their circle was 19-year-old 𝘔𝘍𝘢𝘐 Flanagan. 𝘔𝘍𝘢 was considered a loyal friend who often found himself alongside 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘢𝑥 during social gatherings. Family members remembered him as respectful, kind, and deeply loved. No one could have imagined that an ordinary morning would become the last day of his life. As July came to an end, there was little indication that the lives of these 3 young people were about to intersect in a way that would capture national attention. In the early hours of July 31, 2022, Mackenzie, 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘢𝘐, and 𝘔𝘍𝘢𝘢𝘢 spent time together before eventually getting into Mackenzie's Toyota Camry. Exactly what everyone was feeling during those final minutes remains known only to them. Investigators would later reconstruct much of the timeline using surveillance cameras, phone records, and digital evidence. But no recording could reveal every conversation inside the vehicle. No witness could describe every emotion. What happened between the 3 occupants during those final moments would become one of the greatest mysteries of the case. As the Camry traveled through 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘁, the roads were relatively quiet. Traffic cameras and surveillance footage later showed the vehicle moving through the area before approaching Alameda Drive, a stretch of road bordered by businesses and office buildings. Nothing about those first moments appeared especially unusual. Then, according to investigators, everything changed. Data stored inside the vehicle later showed that the Camry accelerated dramatically. Rather than slowing as it approached the end of the roadway, the vehicle continued gaining speed. Within seconds, it reached nearly 100 miles per hour. Investigators would later focus intensely on one crucial detail. According to the vehicle's recorded data, there was no evidence of significant braking before impact. Instead, the accelerator remained engaged as the car raced toward a commercial building. At approximately 5:30 that morning, the Toyota left the roadway and slammed into the side of a brick building with catastrophic force. The impact was so violent that emergency responders immediately recognized the severity of the crash. The front of the vehicle was almost completely destroyed. Debris scattered across the scene. The building itself sustained extensive structural damage. Inside the car, the consequences were devastating. Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan suffered fatal injuries. Despite emergency efforts, neither survived. Mackenzie Shirilla was critically injured but alive. First responders worked quickly to remove her from the wreckage before she was transported to a nearby hospital. News of the crash spread rapidly through the community. Initially, many viewed it as another heartbreaking example of how quickly excessive speed can turn fatal. Friends and relatives struggled to process the unimaginable loss. Parents received phone calls that no family ever wants to answer. Classmates expressed disbelief on social media. Flowers and memorials soon appeared as loved ones gathered to remember Dominic and Davian. At first glance, the tragedy seemed painfully straightforward. A young driver, excessive speed, a horrific collision. But investigators are trained to look beyond first impressions. Every fatal crash undergoes careful examination. Officers documented tire marks. They measured the roadway. They inspected the vehicle. They downloaded information stored within the Toyota's electronic systems. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses was collected. Each piece of evidence represented another part of a puzzle that had yet to be solved. As specialists reviewed the data, several findings immediately stood out. The vehicle had reached an extraordinary speed on a road where such acceleration made little sense. There appeared to be no meaningful attempt to avoid the collision. The path taken by the vehicle raised additional questions. Detectives also began examining the relationships between the driver and the two passengers. What they uncovered would eventually transform the investigation from a traffic fatality into a homicide case. That shift would shock not only the families involved, but also legal experts across the country. Charging someone with murder after a car crash is uncommon, because prosecutors must prove something far more difficult than negligence or recklessness. They must prove intent. Did Mackenzie Shirilla deliberately drive into that building? Or was there another explanation hidden beneath the tragedy? As investigators searched for answers, they would begin analyzing every message, every phone call, every surveillance recording, and every bite of digital evidence they could find. What they discovered would become the foundation of one of the most debated prosecutions in recent memory. In the hours following the crash, investigators faced the same question that confronts authorities after every fatal collision. What happened? At first, the answer seemed simple. A young driver had been traveling at an extraordinarily high speed before crashing into a commercial building. But investigators knew that appearances could be deceptive. Every serious crash leaves behind a story written in physical evidence, and their job was to read it carefully. The 𝘔𝘁𝘢𝘴𝘩 Police Department, assisted by crash reconstruction specialists and forensic experts, began preserving every possible piece of evidence. The damaged Toyota Camry was secured for examination. The roadway was measured in detail. Debris patterns were documented. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses was collected before it could be overwritten. Each piece of evidence would either support the theory of an accident or point somewhere entirely different. One of the most important discoveries came from the vehicle itself. Modern cars record critical driving information in an event data recorder, often referred to as a vehicle's black box. Although it does not capture conversations or video, it preserves technical information from the moments before a collision, including speed, throttle position, braking activity, and steering inputs. When investigators downloaded the data from Mackenzie Shirilla's Toyota Camry, the results immediately caught their attention. According to the recorded data, the vehicle accelerated rapidly in the seconds before impact. The speed climbed until it reached approximately 100 miles per hour. Even more significant was what the data did not show. Investigators found no meaningful braking immediately before the collision. The accelerator remained heavily engaged until the final moments. To crash reconstruction experts, that detail was impossible to ignore. In many high-speed accidents, drivers instinctively slam on the brakes or attempt to steer away from danger, even if those efforts ultimately fail. Human reflexes often take over in a split second. Here, investigators believe the recorded data suggested something different. The absence of braking would later become one of the prosecution's strongest arguments, that the crash was intentional. But the vehicle data was only the beginning. Investigators also reviewed surveillance cameras positioned throughout the area. Several cameras captured portions of the Toyota's route before the collision. Although the footage did not reveal what was happening inside the vehicle, it helped establish the car's movements and speed as it approached Alameda Drive. Frame by frame, investigators reconstructed the vehicle's final journey. They concluded that the Camry accelerated aggressively along a stretch of road that ended near the commercial building. There was no evidence from the footage that another vehicle had forced Mackenzie off the road. There were no pedestrians suddenly crossing her path. No obstacle appeared that would explain such an extreme maneuver. The physical evidence and video seemed to tell the same story. The next step was understanding why. Investigators turned their attention to the relationships between the three occupants. They interviewed friends, relatives, and others who knew Mackenzie and Dominic. Those conversations painted a picture of a young couple whose relationship had become increasingly unstable. Witnesses described periods of affection, followed by arguments and emotional tension. Investigators also examined digital evidence, including text messages and phone records. Among the communications they reviewed were messages exchanged between Mackenzie and Dominic before the crash. The prosecution would later argue that these communications demonstrated ongoing conflict between the two. However, the defense maintained that disagreements between teenagers were common and did not establish a motive for murder. As detectives continued gathering information, another detail became important. Investigators determined that Mackenzie had previously driven along the same route where the crash occurred. To prosecutors, this suggested familiarity with the roadway and its layout. During trial, they argued that this familiarity supported their theory that the crash location had not been chosen randomly. The defense strongly disagreed, arguing that driving the same streets in one's hometown was entirely ordinary and proved nothing about criminal intent. As the investigation expanded, authorities also examined Mackenzie's medical condition. Because she survived the collision with significant injuries, doctors evaluated her physical and neurological health. Mackenzie later reported having no memory of the moments leading up to the crash. Memory loss after severe head trauma is well documented in medical literature, making it difficult to determine whether the claimed amnesia resulted from the collision or whether she genuinely could not recall what had happened beforehand. The defense also explored whether a medical event might have contributed to the crash. At different stages of the legal proceedings, questions were raised about whether a sudden loss of consciousness or another health issue could explain the lack of braking. Investigators, however, found no evidence they believed supported that conclusion. As forensic experts completed their analysis, prosecutors began looking at the case through a very different lens. If the evidence showed that Mackenzie intentionally accelerated toward the building without attempting to stop, then this was no longer merely a traffic fatality. It could legally qualify as murder. That conclusion represented a dramatic shift. Fatal crashes caused by speeding are often prosecuted under offenses such as vehicular homicide, or aggravated vehicular homicide. Charging someone with murder required proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the driver acted with purpose. It was an unusually high legal threshold. Yet prosecutors believed the combination of digital evidence, surveillance footage, relationship history, and crash reconstruction met that burden. The decision sent shockwaves through the community. Many people struggled to understand how a teenager who had nearly died herself could now face allegations of intentionally killing two people. Others believed the evidence justified the charges. Public opinion quickly became divided. Television commentators debated the meaning of the vehicle data. Legal analysts questioned whether intent could truly be inferred from the absence of braking. Online discussions became increasingly emotional, with many people reaching firm conclusions long before the case ever entered a courtroom. For the families of 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘐𝑢 and 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘐𝑢𝑛, however, the public debate changed nothing. They had buried their sons. Now they faced the possibility of reliving every painful detail during a murder trial. Meanwhile, Mackenzie was recovering physically while preparing for the most significant legal battle of her life. She was no longer simply the survivor of a horrific crash. She had become the defendant in a double murder case. The prosecution believed the investigation had uncovered the truth. The defense insisted the evidence told a very different story. Ultimately, only the courtroom could determine which interpretation would prevail. As the investigation came to a close, the case moved from the crash scene to the courtroom. By then, it had become one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Ohio. The central issue was no longer whether Mackenzie Shirilla had been driving the car. That fact was never disputed, nor was there any dispute that Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan had died in the collision. Instead, the entire case revolved around a single question. Did Mackenzie Shirilla intentionally drive into the building, or was this a catastrophic accident? That question would determine whether she was guilty of murder, or whether the prosecution had failed to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Because Mackenzie had chosen to waive her right to a jury trial, the case would be decided by a judge alone. That meant every piece of evidence, every witness, and every legal argument would be weighed by a single person responsible for determining both the facts and the law. When the trial began, prosecutors laid out their theory. They argued that this was not a moment of panic or loss of control. According to the state, Mackenzie had made a deliberate decision to accelerate her vehicle toward the building with Dominic and Davian still inside. To support that theory, prosecutors relied heavily on the digital evidence recovered during the investigation. They reminded the court that the Toyota Camry's event data recorder showed the accelerator remained engaged until the collision. The vehicle reached nearly 100 miles per hour. There was no significant evidence of braking. Crash reconstruction experts testified that the physical evidence was consistent with a vehicle that had been intentionally accelerated rather than one whose driver was desperately trying to avoid a collision. Surveillance footage was also introduced. Although the cameras did not capture the inside of the vehicle, prosecutors argued that the recordings showed a continuous path toward the point of impact without any obvious attempt to change course. To the prosecution, these facts supported one conclusion. This was an intentional act. But prosecutors knew that technical evidence alone might not persuade the court. Intent often has to be inferred from surrounding circumstances. So they turned to the relationship between Mackenzie and Dominic. Witnesses described a relationship that had experienced conflict in the days leading up to the crash. The state argued that the emotional tension between the couple provided a possible motive. Investigators also presented testimony suggesting Mackenzie was familiar with the roadway and had driven the same route before. According to the prosecution, that familiarity made it less likely that she had accidentally failed to recognize the road's end. The defense, however, challenged nearly every aspect of that argument. Defense attorneys acknowledged the tragic outcome, but maintained that tragedy alone does not prove murder. They argued that the prosecution had built its case on assumptions rather than direct evidence. There was no confession. No eyewitness testified that Mackenzie announced an intention to kill anyone. No text message explicitly stated she planned to crash the car. The defense reminded the court that proving intent requires more than suspicion. It requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense also addressed Mackenzie's physical condition. After surviving such a violent collision, she suffered serious injuries and later reported having no memory of the crash itself. Defense attorneys argued that memory loss after severe trauma is medically recognized and should not be interpreted as evidence of guilt. They also explored whether a medical event could have contributed to the collision. Although the court heard arguments regarding possible medical explanations, prosecutors maintained that no credible evidence established a condition that would explain the vehicle's final movements. Expert testimony became one of the most important aspects of the trial. Crash reconstruction specialists explained how they interpreted the vehicle's data. Medical experts discussed the effects of traumatic brain injuries and memory loss. Investigators described how they collected evidence and reconstructed the sequence of events. Each witness added another layer to a case that had already become deeply polarizing. Outside the courtroom, public opinion remained sharply divided. Some believed the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. To them, driving at nearly 100 miles per hour without braking pointed strongly toward intent. Others remained unconvinced. They questioned whether it was possible to know what had happened inside the car during those final seconds. Could panic have played a role? Could a momentary lapse, distraction, or medical issue explain the evidence? Those questions continued to fuel debate far beyond Ohio. For the families of 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘴𝘩 and 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘴𝘩, however, the legal arguments were secondary to the devastating loss they had suffered. Every day of testimony forced them to revisit the worst day of their lives. They listened as experts discussed vehicle speeds, impact angles, and electronic data, technical details that all stemmed from the deaths of two young men they loved. Meanwhile, Mackenzie sat through proceedings that would determine the rest of her future. Still a teenager at the time of the crash, she now faced the possibility of spending decades behind bars if the judge accepted the prosecution's theory. As both sides concluded their cases, the courtroom waited for the judge's decision. The ruling would not simply answer whether Mackenzie had caused the crash. It would answer whether the law considered that crash to be an intentional double murder. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, the decision immediately made headlines across the country. Some saw it as justice. Others believed reasonable doubt still existed. And even after the trial ended, the controversy surrounding the case was far from over. After days of testimony, expert analysis, and legal arguments, the courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver a decision that would forever shape the lives of everyone connected to the case. The evidence had been presented. The witnesses had testified. Now, the court had to answer the question that had divided investigators, legal experts, and the public from the very beginning. Was this a tragic accident or an intentional act of murder? In August 2023, the judge found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty of multiple offenses, including the murders of 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘴𝘩 and 𝘔𝘠𝘢𝘴𝘩. In announcing the verdict, the judge concluded that the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Mackenzie had intentionally driven her vehicle into the commercial building. The court placed significant weight on several pieces of evidence. The vehicle's event data recorder showed that the Toyota accelerated to nearly 100 miles per hour. The data indicated no meaningful braking before impact. Surveillance footage supported the reconstruction of the vehicle's path. The judge also considered the evidence surrounding Mackenzie's relationship with 𝘊𝘊𝘢𝘴𝘩 and the arguments presented by both sides regarding motive and intent. Taken together, the court determined that these factors established purposeful conduct rather than an accident. The ruling immediately drew national attention. Some legal observers described the case as unusual because murder convictions arising from vehicle crashes are relatively rare. Typically, prosecutors pursue charges such as aggravated vehicular homicide unless they believe they can prove deliberate intent. In this case, the judge concluded that the evidence met that exceptionally high legal standard. For the families of 𝘊𝘊𝘢𝘴𝘩 and Davian Flanagan, the verdict brought a measure of legal closure. Although no court decision could undo their loss, they expressed hope that the judgment reflected accountability for what had happened. Family members spoke about the lives Dominic and Davian should have had, the careers they might have pursued, the families they might have started, and the futures that ended in a matter of seconds. For Mackenzie Shirilla and her family, the outcome was profoundly different. Still a young woman, she now faced spending many years in prison. The court later sentenced her to 15 years to life, meaning she would become eligible for parole only after serving the minimum term required under Ohio law. Following the sentencing, Mackenzie's legal team filed appeals. The defense argued that the evidence presented at trial did not establish intent beyond a reasonable doubt and challenged aspects of the court's legal reasoning. They maintained that the prosecution's case relied heavily on inferences rather than direct proof of a deliberate plan to kill. Appellate courts carefully reviewed the record from the trial. That review focused not on whether another judge might have reached a different conclusion, but on whether the law had been properly applied and whether sufficient evidence supported the convictions. Ultimately, the convictions were upheld. The reviewing courts concluded that the trial court had sufficient evidence upon which to base its findings, leaving the original judgment in place. Even with the appeals resolved, public debate did not disappear. The case continued to spread across social media, podcasts, documentaries, and legal discussions. One group argued that the digital evidence spoke for itself. To them, accelerating to nearly 100 miles per hour without meaningful braking could not reasonably be explained as an accident. Another group remained unconvinced. They questioned whether intent can truly be determined from vehicle data alone. Some believed that emotional distress, panic, or another unknown factor might have contributed to the crash in ways that no reconstruction could fully explain. Those differing opinions illustrate why the case remains so widely discussed. The law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not proof beyond every possible doubt. After hearing weeks of testimony and examining all the admitted evidence, the trial judge concluded that burden had been met. The appellate courts later agreed. Whether members of the public personally agree with that conclusion often depends on how they interpret the same evidence. That difference of opinion is part of what has kept the case in the public conversation long after the trial ended. Beyond the legal arguments, however, one fact remains beyond dispute. 2 young men lost their lives on a summer morning. Their families continue to live with that loss every single day. A young woman who survived the crash now lives with the consequences of the court's verdict. 3 families were changed forever. The Mackenzie Shirilla case is ultimately a reminder of how complex the criminal justice system can be when technology, forensic science, and human behavior intersect. Electronic data can reveal what a vehicle was doing. Surveillance cameras can capture where a car traveled. Experts can reconstruct speed, impact, and movement. But determining why someone acted the way they did remains one of the most difficult questions any court is ever asked to answer. Whether viewed as a carefully reasoned conviction or as a case that still raises difficult questions, it stands as one of the most closely examined criminal prosecutions involving a fatal vehicle crash in recent American history. And perhaps that is why it continues to resonate. Not because everyone agrees on the answer, but because it forces us to confront how justice is determined when only fragments of the truth remain. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing to Whispered Pages for more carefully researched true crime stories based on verified evidence and court records. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.